So welcome, Ariel Ross. I'm the head of creative operations at Asana. Previously worked at Airbnb, Apple, agencies, all over the place. Pretty nomadic, have lived all over the place as well. So really excited to see all the folks coming from different spots around the world. Today, what we're going to do is a little bit heavy, I won't lie. So it might be good for a revisit. I'm going to go into a thing called the Ariel approach, where you're looking at everything from the top down, how to stage and scope for capacity needs. If folks aren't familiar with the RACI model, how we can map that to timing and estimates, and then how we can also see the individual view versus the holistic company view. Why is workload important and why does it matter? So it's really the volume and complexity of tasks assigned to an individual within a given time frame for specific deliverables. So really, it reminds me of SMART goals or something like that, where you have all these qualifiers, but just looking at task volume really isn't enough to give a good picture of what folks are doing and what's on their plate. It's really synergistic with capacity and understanding the balance of existing priorities assigned to an individual against new or inbound assignments. Seeing the stack of what is assigned to a person can really help route any kind of net new work towards who's the right person to staff for it. As I mentioned, looking at task count is not an accurate view. You can see all of these things and say like, okay, that seems reasonable to do 40 hours a week, no problem. But then once it's mapped against the complexity of the task, it's definitely not a science. And here I just have kind of like traffic light, red to green. And when all of that's added up, it's 165 capacity. So oops, that's a little bit too much for one person to do in a week. So now talking about the Ariel approach. And that's really top down from looking at the project to the person. As we're going through this, there's different stages. And required for anything is that you need your inputs to be informed on how to scope. So those inputs include the brief, what the timing is, and the budget. And you'll hear me probably say this over and over and over again. Those are the three inputs you need. So if one's missing, it makes everything much more challenging to be accurate. So from there would be building out a project and then creating sub-stages, which would then identify roles and how long folks are needed within those roles. So that's all of the scoping stages, and then that will be mapped against existing resourcing. So would that be internal people? Would that be external? Or is there enough capacity that they would need a new headcount? So looking at this, we're starting with just the stages. So here we have the timeline view. So we're looking at months, and this is very minimalized just to get the high level concept there. And with anything, there's pre-production, there's production, and post-production. So we can kind of just bucket these. And in this instance, we're just doing 2-month buckets just to keep this very simplistic. Now looking at scoping for capacity and needs. And so as we're building the stages, it's first the project, the 3 parts that we're talking about: pre-production, production, post-production, and then looking into stages. This is very, very generic and looking at each of these. So within pre-production, starting with strategy and then a strategy refinement, starting with messaging, and that's copywriting, and then starting with concepting, which is design. So as you can see with this timeline, we're adding on to the copy. So within production, it's writing the copy refinements, lo-fi or low fidelity design and refined design. And then post-production would be hypothetically color grading, bulk exports, and legal review. So just seeing at a very broad level what some of these stages are within each of the time periods for production. And now how to determine roles and duration. Within each of these, we can kind of break out who do we need to get this stuff done. So remembering that at the top, there's the months, and it's for 2 months for pre-production. And let's just say 1 month for strategy. We can say, okay, because within the entire production, you only need a strategist at the beginning, hypothetically. So your lead strategist and then a strategist. And then with copy to start the messaging. So once the strategy is set up, you're informed by messaging and concepting. Then you can move into the other stages. And a great way to do this is to use the RACI chart. So I'll get into what this is, but it's a way to correlate the level of effort with the task stages. So if you all are familiar with this, RACI. It's a standard way to assign responsibility. So it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. But what that really means is responsible, is who does the work. Accountable is the decision maker. Consulted approves or provides input, and informed is looped in the process. This is kind of a busy slide, but just to break this down, is that looking at who does the work, the decision maker, input, and looped in, we can map that to what the, from a percentage perspective. So just to take a step back, in talking about capacity and planning, there's many, many ways to do this. And there's not a silver bullet. With agile planning, there's point systems. There's many ways to go about it, but my preference is honestly just doing percentages, because 0 to 100 is very easy to do. And then on the right, you can see mapping the percentages to hours of week. So in different countries, this might be different. In the States, 40 hours is typical for full-time, 100% of the week. So in looking at things, if you say, okay, I have an account manager who's allocated 5%, and that equals to 2 hours a week. So they might jump in on 2 meetings, and that's their allocation. So it's a really simple way to correlate what their role is in the project and how much time should be awarded to the effort that they need to make. So I hope this makes sense. And this brings us into resourcing and how it all comes together. Looking at our list here, so we have pre-production, strategy, messaging, and concepting. So we're looking at a strategy department, copy department, and design. And this is mapping out to the RACI, so responsible, accountable, consulted, and the roles required to get each of these stages done. And at this stage, it's very hypothetical. So this is in an ideal world. This is and again, based on the brief, the timing and the budget would really determine the level of effort and how many roles. And just to keep this simple, we've gone with lead strategist and strategist. So thinking about the strategist is the one doing the work, and the lead strategist would be consulted. So that's why they're at 15%. So just making those correlations. And then you have the lead copywriter with oversight, the copywriter, the art director with oversight to the senior designer, and then also adding in a lead designer or creative director at 10% for consulted. So thinking about this being a net new project, you might bring in additional leadership to provide input on the direction of a project. And now I'm so embarrassed by how messy my slides are, but there's a lot of information here, but essentially going through and just imagine highlighting with the RACI chart. So going through and saying, okay, so for production, we no longer need strategy. We're looking at writing the copy, refinements, lo-fi design, refining design. So we're heavy on copy and design. And then with post-production, there's some specialties with a color artist, but also design and things like bulk exports. So that would be a more junior designer who would be doing production exports. So this kind of goes through where within each stage, determining what the roles are, what their responsibilities are, and then what their percentage allocation is. So in our hypothetical world, this is how it maps out, and can really see, and again, keeping in mind that there are the months at the top, we have the timing that's necessary for each of these headcounts. So within the production stage, we'll need a full-time dedicated junior copywriter and a junior designer and half-time senior designer. So start thinking about how this shapes up against staffing of pre-existing people that are internal, or if you need to leverage and bring in external support. So it really works if the whole system works. So a lot of this is chicken and the egg. So if you're not currently tracking capacity, then you can't really compare the new project to your whole ecosystem. However, if you are tracking projects in some way, then you might be able to make a few adjustments to enable visibility. So there might already be a process that you have in place where adding a custom field would be able to capture this information. It's not a difficult, or you don't have to redo everything, but there is definitely change management required. So there's really two ways that are the most available to go about this. One would be a full stop. So that would be auditing all projects in flight and pending and restructure with the quote unquote new method. That could also be just getting a view of everything that's going on. So that could, as I mentioned, if you have something in place, it could be adding a custom field. It could just be a minor alteration, but just taking a look at everything that's going on. The second piece is more of a future set it and roll out view. So setting a date that all processes will go into effect. So older projects can be completed as is, but starting at X date, all new work will be measured in the new process. So that way there's less of a burden to kind of take more resources to audit and can just say, starting on, let's say Q3, we're going to be moving forward, capturing capacity. Now, as we're thinking about staffing, I mentioned at the top, we have the months here. So, 2 months at a time for each of these sections, and the ideal allocation of who we need for what roles. And this really informs on who's available. Do we need additional support, or does the timing need to change? So if you look at your staff and you're slammed, there's no way you could take on this project now. Is there a way to go back to the client and say, hey, can we change the timing? If that's not viable, maybe say no to the project. There are many different ways to go about this, but just having an open mind to see how this can either be slotted into existing work, or if it needs a different approach from a budget, brief, and timing perspective. So that's going back to the inputs at the beginning. So this is as I mentioned, the top-down view, the aerial view where you're looking down on everything, and you can see within each department what's allocated, with each person, what they're doing, and then what the assignments are. So really getting a whole view of the company's ecosystem and then down to specific assignments. And what this looks like, and this is somewhat abstracted, and these are all fake names. So I did like a name. I was trying to find a fantasy name generator that would be funny that folks might get, but anyway, these are just generic names. But essentially within each person, we would be able to see what is allocated to them, so what their assignments are, and then on a weekly basis, what their capacity is. So what the aggregate of those tasks are, to see when they have availability, because some things may take longer than a week, as we're seeing here in this example. And once that is aggregated by person, then we're able to see the full workload. So this is broken out by department, seeing your designers, your copy, strategy. So where there are the highlights, it's those people have full availability to be plugged in. But then even looking at someone like Amanda, where the third week of January, she's at 15%. So maybe that could be someone who could be leveraged to be pulled in to help support. So just having a view of the capacity. I think also as an agency, from a profitability standpoint, you really want to have a minimum of 80% allocation for staff. So that's the lowest barrier to keep someone engaged and profitable. And ideally, as we're talking about burnout, we do not want to go over 100%. And that's where you start thinking about trade-offs and who can take on that overflow work. And this is just kind of summarizing what I've been saying, but just having this staff overview consolidates effort of projects based on week to see what's the most efficient way to see who's available. Do we need additional support? And does the timing need to change? So does this just not work at all? And do we need an alternative approach? And really, I think we're getting towards the end, but a lot of agencies call this casting, and that's the stage where we are determining exactly who is working on which project. So looking at what the new project projection is and what that estimate is, and mapping that against the aerial view, which is the consolidated individual's workload. then we're really able to identify who's available, who can work on this, and then make some calibrations. So if, let's say, a lead designer is not available, maybe 2 junior designers would be able to jump in. So just trying to figure out what those trade-offs are based on capacity. So really, the summary of this whole thing is the first step is really to maintain resource hygiene. So the more comprehensive your diligence is, the easier it is on a daily basis and for future planning. The second piece is tracking altitude. So make sure you're looking at the individual, the group, the project, the quarter, and every level informs the next and unlocks visibility. So this can get extremely granular. It can be very broad, but just as long as there's that visibility, it really can inform on how these things are routed. And then there's also quant and qual benefits. So not all benefits are quantifiable. So thinking about ROI, metrics, things like that, but also qualitative support. So as we're thinking about employee bandwidth, burnout, increasing employee engagement, it's really, really critical to have visibility into what they're working on to ensure that they're engaged and happy in their roles. So this has really holistic benefits by doing a little bit of work on the upfront to be able to map this out really pays dividends in the long term. And I think we're on to Q&A.
Yay! Well, amazing. Thank you so much, Ariel. And thank you for taking through the whole process. It's always good to see how someone thinks who's very logical and strategic as you are. And I love how very structured your approach is. And I think structured approach to creativity is something very, very rare. So I really, really appreciate you sharing all the insights. So the first question for you, Ariel, is how to manage resourcing and helping young designers handle context switching that sometimes is required for scaling a team. And I can totally relate to that question, by the way.
Oh, same. I think as teams scale and they start taking on additional responsibilities or supporting other internal teams, it's really critical to identify the context. And I think that might be an oversight for some creative directors not really thinking about it, saying, okay, well, this designer's free, they can jump in on this thing. But if there's context switching, what that really means is you might have a different audience, you might have a different objective, a different messaging, anything. And for each designer to look at a new item and have to reset their mind. So understanding what's the brief, who's the audience, what's the messaging. Every time you have to do that, you're losing more and more energy. So the best way to really overcome that is by grouping together as many correlated tasks. So whether it's within the same client, so that can be the same brand guidelines, things like that, whether it's within the same audience, if there are specific demographics that you're focused on, or if it is similar messaging. So is this conversion messaging? Is it lead gen? Whatever the case, being able to find correlations within the work makes it so much easier for the designer because there's less variables that they have to focus on. So just being able to group those is the best approach.
And is there like a magic number? I don't know how many projects a person can handle, how many different things should be in the day. Is there any rule of thumb on those?
It's really challenging because, as I mentioned earlier, with each of these tasks, there's the complexity involved in addition to just the actual work itself. So understanding the responsibility of the designer, if it is very simple, if they're doing support and maybe exports, that could be, you could do, I don't know, 20 tasks a day potentially. But if it is more focused thinking or ideation or things that need really flow state, I'd say that's much more minimal. But just as a holistic view, I would say the max at a time would preferably be 3. So as we're thinking 3 different clients or 3 different large scale projects, would be really the amount of change that is viable for someone to really stay engaged and keep up.
That's great. The rule of 3. That is fantastic. A question that I suppose a lot of people can relate to what is your best advice for managing the number of rounds of clients' revisions or minor changes after a handover, revision changes and all of those.
Yeah, how minor are these changes? I think that there are a lot of things that you can do proactively. So upstream, when you're writing contracts with the client, to be able to bake in, these are the amount of reviews that we're doing. So that's one way to set the right expectations, because when we see that clients are asking for additional rounds or more changes, it's really a culprit of not having the right expectation. So they might think, okay, I'm working with this agency, they're on retainer, I can tap them whenever they want. Someone from this department told me to make these changes. Sure, like let's just have them do it. So I would say really establishing what the rules of engagement are essentially with the agency, or sorry, with the client. So establishing these are the amount of rounds and this is the fidelity. So as the project's going through, it's also helpful to say, as we're getting to this final stretch, the fidelity, it might be 10% change. So we could change maybe a copy, but we can't change design. So really setting the guide rails. And if it's something that they really want to change, then that's when it comes to a change order and saying, okay, this is outside of scope. We'll have to re-establish what the cost would be, what the timing is, because this isn't what we agreed to. So really setting up what those parameters are, those shared agreements, and also being very transparent and clear about what the expectations are for each round.
Brilliant. Setting expectations, always the key. We have quite a few questions in chat about the tools that to use for everything you just described, or in general, tools that you'd recommend for this process.
Well, I do work for Asana, so I would say I'm quite partial to that. Not trying to promote by any means, but that is what I use. And within Asana, there is a workload feature. However, it just tracks task volume. And as I mentioned, we need a lot more information than just that. So I've been able to create custom fields. I would say with comparable products, with things like RACI, you can also do custom fields, smart sheets, all of those other tools also enable this. And one kind of hacky way is to have the custom fields and then run a report, or have a dashboard, a live dashboard that shows what's going on. So the examples that I provided were all in Excel, and that is a very, very scrappy way to get it done. And I have been at an agency where that's how we managed workload, was in Excel. I'd also share that with different enterprise companies, they typically have proprietary software. So that's why there isn't kind of like that silver bullet tool that's on the market, because a lot of the companies have their own software that they've created. And as far as consumer tools, I think it's more about adjusting the tools that you're using to make them work for you and to really have the fields and the information that you need for tracking.
Brilliant, thank you. And again, not promoting Asana. This event, by the way, is not sponsored by Asana, but we do use Asana as well. And we find it very helpful with, as Ariel mentioned, the custom fields or those custom columns that can track workload and how heavy the task is. So you can really adjust it, but I'm sure all the other tools can do similar functions as well. We have actually a similar question, lots of questions about outcome versus output. Nick is asking, what do you think about managing outcome versus output or workload? And we have a very similar one submitted before around that, plus culture. So how do you balance the productivity and efficiency and everything with the culture as well?
Yeah, I think in thinking about culture, it's a little tricky one, but I would say a lot of it, because each company may have its own culture and how to maintain that. But the way that I look at things is really looking at employee engagement and how to keep folks happy. So if there's work that is kind of redundant or repetitive and that can get really boring, are there opportunities within that client or within another client or internally can get that individual excited to be able to do that?
What do you think about managing outcomes versus the outputs?
I guess the output means the actual creative itself, and the outcome is the performance. Yeah, so I would say everything should be aligned with the performance. That's what the brief is all about, is how we're trying to solve this problem. How do we solve it? So going to the agency and saying, this is what we need to, this is our problem. how do we solve it? With the outcome, it really should be proving the brief and being able to satisfy the need of the client. When it comes to the output, it should really be aligned with what the goals are as well. So I feel like there's a high correlation between the two. They both should be supportive of the mission of the brief and what the goals of the project are, and shouldn't really differ too much from what the objective is.
Brilliant. Nick, let us know if that helped you with your challenge that you're facing. We also have questions regarding managing multiple projects at the same time. How do you apply this approach when you manage multiple projects?
Yeah, I would say I would be fortunate to have one project. That I don't know that that's ever happened in my career. So there's really an expectation that folks really will have multiple projects at all times, all with different start and end dates, with overlapping cycles of production. And it's really in looking at this holistic view and tracking projects end to end can really give that visibility into what is it that I'm assigned to, what is it that I'm responsible for, what's shipping when. And by getting that aggregate, there's also the visibility into your capacity. So if I'm hitting 100%, I'm able to go to my manager and say like, hey, I'm tapped out. There's no more that can be put on my plate. Or if there's new work that's coming in, being able to route it to someone who has availability. So as it is working with multiple projects, I think it's really critical to have self-awareness of what's on your plate and what you're committed to, but also giving visibility upward to management and so on, to say, either, hey, I'm bored, I don't have enough to do, or I'm overwhelmed and I need some support here. So it's really coordination and collaboration with management and with other folks on your team.
And as always, communication
Yes.
is key. Talking to people, telling people what's going on, how are you feeling. Stevie Wong, would you like to ask your question? I feel like it needs a bit of context.
Yeah, it kind of is just echoing what you were just saying, but obviously as different projects come in, especially when you're working not in-house, but on an agency side. When I was looking at that, beautiful kind of like chart that you created of like January to March, it kind of would be the focus would be pre-pro, and then we would move into the next 3 months would be production. Whereas on the agency side, realistically, the projects come in at so many different times. So I find that one of the challenges is to really be able to assess in these different buckets how the team's doing their capacity level, but in all these different buckets, it kind of hits differently. So just wondering if there is also a different way to kind of look, to kind of holistically look at how the capacity is spread out in less of a clean cut way, and not of the January to March, it's only pre-pro, and then the next 3, it's like production. So just wanted to, get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the example is just for one project, and kind of this is the life cycle of a project. But as you layer on different projects that are all starting and ending at different times, I think that's also an important way to look at who's doing what at when. So one way to prioritize work is to see, as I mentioned, something like strategy is only working during pre-production. So when they're offloaded of pre-production, what projects are coming in that they would be able to hop into. Or if a project's in post-production, then can we pull designers that are available to work in production for a different project? So I think in addition to really seeing what the full allocation is also, as folks are staggered in different stages of different projects, who, when they're rolling off of one, can they be pulled into another? So being able to forecast that might be a little tricky, but having the documentation and keeping track of it is the best way to really start to have that holistic view where you can really see how that lines up.
Actually, on that note, Ariel, and how do you look at resourcing in the more long term? Do you plan like a yearly plan, as many people mentioned? You actually don't know what will happen in a year, but are there any guidelines that you set up at the beginning of any year that we can't handle more than 20 projects this year? with the team that we have, we need to hire if that expense, like, is there any more long-term strategy that you're doing when resourcing?
Yeah, I would say I would love to do annual planning. That's a dream of mine when, maybe one day once clients know what they want. There was one client that came to me once and said, we want to do a 1-year engagement with you for brand assets. Here's our budget. What can you do for us? So we had to be like, okay, we could do like an audit or refresh, integrated campaign, like starting to scope out what their entire year of work would be. So I think there's a lot of different ways that these things manifest. The two things that I can think of is, one is if there are ongoing client relations. So let's say you have embedded employees that are on-site vendors, as something you understand that there's an agreement with a specific client that's maybe multi-year or things like that. What is the dedicated team that will be servicing that client? And if you're hitting that kind of capacity, so those folks might be dedicated to that client, and then there's sub projects within the client. So that way you can see, okay, for this year, we have this retainer and so on, and we can allocate these folks for that client. The other way is really, it's holistic. I mean, like, it's a dream to be able to forecast that much forward. I would say at best, I've really been able to accomplish maybe a quarter at a time. So looking 3 months in 3-month chunks of what's coming up and being able to commit to that. A big part of it is, as I mentioned with casting, is if new work comes in, let's say it's a brand new client, and I have to see, okay, who's available, who would be able to make this happen during this timeline. And if it can't work out, it can't work out. But as you're speaking to additional headcount, do we need more support? As you start aggregating how much money's left on the table, or looking at the entire landscape of staff and who's being overburdened or who is over bandwidth, then that's when it starts to make a case to have additional headcount. So really, the question I always ask myself is there 40 hours of work per week for someone to do this thing? So if it's a design ask and specific client says, like, I want a dedicated designer, I want someone on this, then I have to think, like, are they going to be working full-time every single day? Is there enough work for this individual to do? And if the answer is no, then it's not viable at that time. But if it gets to be that the capacity keeps showing over bandwidth, then that makes a clear case that it's time to bring someone new on. Yeah, so I would say from a long-term planning perspective, it really depends on if the client is a long-term kind of embedded go-to client versus the most I would recommend is probably on a quarterly basis to be able, and personally, I'm very rigid about my commitments. If I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. So never want to overpromise. And that's the way I approach things, by quarters.
On that note, we actually have a question from Veronica. How do we keep management accountable to actually do capacity planning and then stick to it?
Oh, again, what a dream. I think a lot of it comes with the zeitgeist of having distributed work right now. I think it's more important than ever that management leadership has visibility into what's getting done. So I think it serves their interests to understand what people are doing, in addition to designers and creative directors and everyone else, to know that they're being allocated an appropriate amount of work. So it kind of goes hand in hand. And if there's a lack of education where leadership doesn't understand, like, well, capacity planning, what is this? Then it might be an opportunity to educate and to come in and say, hey, like, wouldn't you like to know who's doing what on your team and when you need to hire and things like that? So I would say that from my experience, leaders have been very receptive to having this type of information. There is a lot of maintenance that's required. So it's not just a set it and forget it, but it's like a weekly update. It's a weekly thing that needs hygiene. So there is a cost associated with maintaining this type of thing. However, when you're having employees that aren't leaving. So you have like lower attrition because folks are more engaged, and there's more clarity on who's doing what, and leadership can have a top-down view and say like, oh, cool, like everything's getting done, then it just makes life so much simpler. So I would say there might be a lack of awareness that this is something that's really critical. But so that might be a conversation of education of why this should be something that needs to be implemented and maintained.
So thank you. My question is, we are as a company using workload management. But the thing is, whenever you have a lot of projects going on and when you are working with project managers or account executives, you know, in projects, things change and daily or weekly. So you have to keep the management or the work, the road plan alive. But when it comes to making those changes, how do you work with account managers or project managers? Because the thing is, whenever it comes to making decisions, you have to involve in those as a creative director, because project managers cannot make those decisions by themselves, but then you find yourselves daily making a lot of these decisions, moving things around and, you know, putting that there and this there, and it takes a lot of time. And then you always ask yourselves, then why we have project managers in our teams? It is my question briefly.
Yeah, I would say part of that might be delegating the resourcing and casting to the project managers. So if there's a system in place where you're able, because I would say like, how are you making the decisions? So if it's all in your head and there isn't visibility for other people to help, then it's going to be challenging for anyone else to jump in and support and make those changes. But if this is captured in a way that's visible for project managers to be able to see what's going on and be able to assign those responsibilities, then that might be an opportunity to offload all of that work to them. Because I would say I've seen specific traffic managers that are dedicated to just trafficking resources and who's doing what. So I would say that for creative director, there's bigger things to focus on than staffing on a weekly or day-to-day basis.
Is there because I love how you said that there needs to be a process. So if everything is in a creative director's head, which I can totally relate to, because you know how long things take, you know who needs to be the best, you know how things need to change to meet the deadline. So you suddenly become half project manager, half creative director. What are the good processes to, I suppose, document that information for a traffic manager or for project manager to start using this information?
Yeah. So again, if everything lives in your head, then it's hard to delegate. It's impossible. So thinking about what are the inputs or what are the considerations that you're using to determine who is being staffed. So if it is around competencies, then maybe there's sub labels or things that you can call folks. So for example, if someone's very good at illustration, they could be a core designer. And if someone who's very good at web could be interactive designer. So giving titles that correlate to their strengths would be a way that informs the traffic manager on who to put on which project. There could also be, the creative director can give a pass and say, like, here's the plan. Are you cool with it? Creative director looks at it and is like, okay, that looks great. There can be some calibration with the project manager to try and get them thinking around the same ways. But the bottom line is, if they don't have visibility into capacity or into competencies, then they won't be enabled to make any decisions. So the more that you can either capture that in some way that's appropriate, or inform or coach the project managers, I think is the best way to get them to learn. So just on from personal experience, there's been times where I know exactly, like, if there's something that's coming in hot, this designer is super fast, like, let's hand it off to that person, they'll be able to flip it. Or this is an engineer that knows this client, so we can get it to that person. So just understanding either, again, with competencies, skills, strengths, who's the right fit is a great way to route things.
Brilliant. I think Katie is making a very valid point regarding this question that actually, what about the kind of the opposite side? How can we stop the project managers from making creative decisions when that should be the role of a creative director?
Yeah, I mean, that comes down to management and having those critical conversations with the project manager to really establish what the responsibilities are. So one way to do this, and this is just kind of a management perspective, is to have them map out what they believe their role and responsibilities are, and then have a conversation, have a dialogue, and say like, okay, well, you're saying that you're staffing this project, but that's not one of your responsibilities. So just going through and calibrating with them face to face is a really effective way to kind of get an alignment on what their expectation of their role is and what they really should be focusing on.
In terms of staffing and project management, I guess we're in a sector that often has to do with the event sector and the show sector. So there's a lot of parties involved. Deadlines are often unnegotiable. So sometimes, yeah, it's feeling like the whole thing is on a limbo, and the whole sector is a bit works in this chaotic atmosphere where things can change very quickly and move around very quickly. So sometimes in terms of staffing, it's almost impossible to anticipate on this, because from one day to the other, there's like an urgent demand that has to be answered. You can't just say we need an extra few days because something needs to be shipped, or this person has to be there, or an order has to be placed, whatever. So how can you deal with that and at the same time create an enjoyable environment for your staff to work in and stay, of course?
Yeah, I would say with hard deadlines, that can tend to just sometimes be easier because there aren't really fluctuations or clients saying, I want another round, things like that. Like, this is the lock date. This is when things are frozen, can't go past that. There's a bit of an advantage by having those hard dates. And with that, understanding, I would say maybe the biggest factors that would kind of cause those little fires and things would be any kind of constraints or changes. So let's say there's a streaming platform and there's some kind of QA bug that happens and we're going live tomorrow, and that needs to be resolved. You got to go over time and make it happen. So I've done a lot of the events and have come across a lot of these issues, but I would say the best approach is really because you have those locked dates, that's more information of who can be available during those times. And if there's overlaps with different clients, and if there's an escalation or something that is super timely, then I'd say those should be the exception to the rule. But the rule really should be like, this is what we've agreed to. These are the folks that are assigned to handle it, to be able to get those things in place. So the other thing that I would say is, as far as inputs and constraints, because that's the biggest thing. And correct, like, if you have, I guess, what are some of the things? Because in my mind, it's kind of the constraints that come and push back or make changes. We can't customize this landing page because the code doesn't allow it, or things like that, that make things take longer than we anticipate. Is that kind of what you've experienced?
Yes, similar like this, or there's a problem in the I don't know, in the production. Somebody who's working on something has to go, or is suddenly taken out of a project, or just this really unexpected situations where it becomes difficult to really rely on the people that are needed to finish things.
Yeah, I think in thinking about external support as well, it might be helpful to have a bench of folks that you can tap in. So that in certain cases, when I've had overflow, it's like, okay, we need this producer to come in, or whatever the case, on a freelance basis. So just having a kind of ongoing contract to be able to pull in additional support when needed. So if someone gets pulled off a project, then you have that bench to be able to tap to bring in.
Yeah, makes sense. Then sometimes it's also difficult bringing in people into an ongoing project and getting them up to speed is sometimes you lose more time with that than solving it yourself and doing a bit of overtime. So
yeah, no, I think that's a misconception too, where they're like, let's just outsource it, or let's just bring a contractor on. But the contractor needs as much training as an employee would, and especially with something that's that fast. So if you do have a bench of people that you go to consistently, they at least would know, maybe not the specifics of each project, but at least the work style and who's who within the company. So they'd have that familiarity. And at least maybe like 25% of the onboarding is handled by going to the same folks.
I have an interesting question. What are the hardest things that you had to say no to in your job?
Oh gosh, the biggest challenges are so I'm in-house, so not agency. And I think the biggest challenge is that when the company has priorities that are revenue driven, things like that, and there are other projects that come up that are very interesting and things that I think that are valuable, but have different KRs or key results that aren't mapped to company goals, it's hard to get advocacy to get those projects through. So by saying no to things, so I'm trying to think of something from a previous role. At a previous job, doing something like a nonprofits page, to me, I really enjoy that kind of work and that advocacy. So being able to get resources to fund redoing the nonprofit page might not be a company priority, but it would be something that I'd like to do. So when the nonprofit team comes to me and I'm like, I'm sorry, we can't do this right now, those are the things that are difficult, those types of trade-offs, but because everything comes down to what are the business objectives, and I understand that. So I'd say that's one of the things that I've had to say no to. And I think just holistically, when it comes to collaborating with cross-functional partners and not being able to meet all the needs that come through. So there might be a lot of good and valid and interesting requests, but because of bandwidth and capacity, just there isn't enough time in the day to get everything done. So just having to say no to some of my internal partners is usually, that's the most challenging thing.
Yeah, I think saying no in general is probably the hardest, but the most useful thing that keeps you on top of your priorities for sure. We have another question related to incoming requests. Henry is asking, how do you manage the urgencies when you have already tracked? How we can solve urgencies without impact on what you're tracking?
Yeah, so with anything that's urgent, I always recommend to have some kind of prioritization criteria. So like it might be urgent to one person, it might not be urgent to another. So just to even the playing field, what is the criteria or the decision matrix to understand how to prioritize things? So does it have a high audience? Is there an executive sponsor? Is this a showstopper? So using the P system for priorities, so P0, 1, 2, 3, just making a correlation to how much of an impact this is. So showstopper meaning this will end the show, this will stop the project, versus P3, which might be I'd like to change the color, or a like to have. So identifying what the priority is first, and if it's determined that it is high priority and things need to be moved around, then it's a discussion of trade-offs. So within all of the work that we're assigned to, what can be either deferred or moved off someone's plate in order to accommodate this incoming request. So I would say a lot of times it's the real world. We're just like, all right, we got to get this done. The boss asked for this. We've got to get this, like so-and-so designer, jump on this. You have 72 hours to get this out the door. But really taking a step back and saying, okay, they're already committed to these 3 projects. Let's hand off one of the projects to another designer. We'll give them this priority. And then that way things are a little more even. Or as I mentioned, deferring. So if a project is less of a priority, than maybe going to the client and saying like, hey, is it okay that we push this out a week? So it's all about trade-offs and ensuring that people are informed and communicate what you're giving and taking to get things done.
Love it. I love how you said that urgency for one person doesn't mean the urgency for another person. I think the word urgency you kind of assume that it's for everyone. But I love your idea of actually thinking where did the urgency came from. Nick has another.
A lot of us, because I mean, everyone is passionate about their work. So it's so if I'm a copywriter and I'm like, oh, I need to get permissions for this quote or something, like this is super urgent, it's a big thing. And then talking, there might be a Super Bowl ad or something that other team is working on. So it's important to also have perspective of what other teams are working on and how does this ask fit into all the things that people are doing. So it's not necessarily a bad thing because people are passionate about what they do and always think, like, this is a very, very important thing. But looking at the whole system, it may not be at that time as urgent as you may think.
I also love the framework urgent and important, like which is urgent, which is important, and which one is urgent and important. It kind of talks about, because there are lots of things that are urgent that are not important, and there are lots of important things that are not urgent that should have a bit of pre-planning. So understanding
Absolutely.
what's in that spot of actually focusing right now. I love the question from Nick about how do you actually decide with your team how many hours are needed for a certain task to be completed?
Yeah, so part of discovery and coming up with that whole scope and planning, part of it is based on experience and understanding, again, the competencies of who's on the team. But then the other piece is also relying on your partners. So if this is an engineering task, go to the engineering manager and say, hey, we're working on this task. What's your estimated hours for this? And the project manager or the producer may come up with a first pass, but then also getting inputs from those experts to ensure that it's aligned. So with any kind of scope that's coming up or any kind of estimate, also checking with the head of copy, art director, or creative director. So there isn't a misaligned expectation, or it's like, yeah, we can do rotoscoping in 24 hours, no problem. And it really takes 2 weeks to do. So it's not expected that a creative director or that producers know everything about every single competency. And that's why there's experts at the company. So just leveraging that expertise to also provide input on, do these hours look reasonable for the brief and everything that's involved. So that's part of the working together and communicating within the teams.
I love the comments on the previous discussion from Jimmy. Your lack of preparation does not constitute an emergency for me. This is brilliant. We have also questions about motivation and how do you motivate the team when they're tired of a client or the client is difficult? Those moments, those painful moments when no one even wants to do any creative work anymore. Any tips on motivating people?
Yeah, I would say I'm trying to think like real world versus theory. And from if I was thinking theory perspective, I'm like, well, understanding what the client's project is, what the impact of that project is, if it's an interesting campaign or is getting visibility or is hitting on a skill set or a new competency that the designer might be interested in, like kind of decoupling the actual client relationship with the work. And say, like, getting the designer excited about the work itself. This is going to be a really cool billboard. This is going to be this is a game that's reaching this new audience, whatever the case. So really kind of selling what the brief is and focusing on the work rather than the relationship, I think is a good way. Then reality hits and you go to these reviews and the client might be a little not so nice. And in those parts, I think you can only control what you can control, right? So you can't control if someone's not a nice person, but by setting the right expectations, I think that's the only way to really keep some kind of guardrails. So if a client is asking for too much or being vague with their feedback, whatever the case is, comes down to communication and expectation setting, and just ensuring that everyone's aligned with what's going on. And I think it's also this trade-off of accountability. So if the client is asking for more changes beyond scope and that's delaying the project and they complain about the delay, it's important to keep track of why these decisions were made and saying, okay, well, this is pushed by 2 days because you were late on your feedback and things like that. So just keeping them accountable for the impact that they're making on the projects, and to get designers and other creatives excited is to just, maybe shield them from the client themselves and focus on the work and what are the different interests that may make that work more appealing.
What is your top tip advice for being able to easily prioritize competing jobs so you know where best to focus your time?
So coming back to that kind of prioritization matrix of what's the highest impact and the largest focus, the highest impact project, that's what I would focus my time on. If I had to choose between 3 projects, I would look at what is the biggest impact for the company, and that's how I would rank them. So, and understanding the goals and the objectives of the company. From an agency perspective, I would say prioritizing, let's say, like you're already assigned to them and it's just how you're scheduling your week and how to do things. I would recommend, based on context switching, trying to group the same types of things together to keep yourself sane. And then I love the stuff about deep focus and blocking out schedules. I also have certain times where I'll turn social off. So I'll turn Slack and everything else off, because those are just distractions. And it's like a immediate email that people expect to respond to. So also establishing with my colleagues at certain points I may not be available on Slack, and just changing my status to like do not disturb type thing. It really comes down to how you work best effectively in order to plan your week, and trying to group things that are as similar as possible. Deadlines obviously are an input as well, but if everything is the same, looking at how to group those things to make it more efficient for you to be able to focus on.
That's great. And I think also understanding yourself, that's probably one thing that I realized, that we're all humans and actually we work better at certain times, and we are productive in certain things at certain times in the day. So sometimes some people love answering emails in the morning, and for some people it's better to do them in the evening. But like planning your day so you know when you feel your best creative self, best productive self, that's something that definitely helped me a lot. Have you seen the creative process penetrate other processes of the company? And if yes, which has been the most impactful one?
I would say with reviews and any kind of reviews and approval cycles that we've been able to really solidify within creative have been expanded to other departments as well. So locking down how many review cycles, what's the fidelity expected within each review. So what's the expected feedback that you're looking for? And I think there's one rule where it's the 80-20 rule, where at the beginning of the project, you can give 80% feedback as it's being shaped up. And then towards the end of the project, you can give about 20% feedback. So because everything is, at a more solidified state. So just being really transparent about what's expected of the reviews will keep people more focused with their feedback and have things that are more actionable. So I know within the creative process, we've done that, where we have our like an internal critique, and then from internal crit, it goes to cross-functional review and things like that. And equally within, let's say like legal or finance, other departments have also picked up some of those same mechanisms that we found successful through our creative reviews.
Can a creative director still be involved in design as well as competently running a studio or managing a team, or is it stretching too much and or diluting impact value add to a larger business? From your experience, Ariel, have you seen someone doing that successfully?
Oh, yeah. I would say I have not seen creative directors that just creative direct, that's really not part, or I haven't seen that in my experience. So I would say the people management component of managing different designers, going through and sorry, I'm looking at the chat and I'm like, oh, what are folks saying? But yeah, I think there's a requirement to also be hands-on. So it really depends company to company how hands-on a creative director is. It might just be oversight and direction. It might just be for the pitch and coming up with here's the messaging and things like that. But I would say it's very rare that I've ever seen a creative director who's not doing work, managing people, and also budgeting to a certain degree and advocating for prioritization and all of those things. So it is, yeah, to Michael's point, wearing a lot of hats at the same time.
Being a creative director is a tough job, everyone wearing lots of hats. And yeah, I think it's, we all wish we would live in a perfect world when we could just do creative things and nothing else. But the more you progress in your career, the more things you need to worry about, and as well as strategic overview of everything. We have an interesting question about, I suppose, on a slightly more technical side. How should automation better serve creative people?
Automation, yes, love it, absolutely love it. I would say any stage of production that is just like moving a peg to the next hole. So that could be that the client provided feedback and then a producer needs to give the feedback to each of the creatives, where there's a human who's doing something that should just be automated. Use an automation 100%. So it's not to replace critical thinking. It's not to replace any kind of creative thoughts or production, but it's really just to eliminate that human error or that lag time of passing one thing to the next. And I think I know as being a producer, when I heard about automation, I was like, oh, they're trying to take my job. But not the case. It's offloading all of those minor tasks that no one wants to do. So there's within Asana, you can set up rules. So let's say there's an approval, so creative gets approved, then you can route that task onto shipping, so people can package and send the assets off. So especially working in multiple time zones, in distributed land, globally and things like that, there isn't any lost time when automation is implemented. So absolutely recommend it. Other alternatives, I like just to plug the course, we talk about things like templatizing, so you're not recreating the wheel every single time. So there's also process automation that just saves a lot of time, keeps things organized and collected, and makes it so anyone can jump in and see where anything is. So I really holistically big fan of automation. Asana, which is where I work. So they have rules and automation, and I believe Monday.com also has automation. I know RACI has ones that you need an administrator to implement. Yeah, any kind of project coordination tool.
Automations definitely help and save creative time for creative work, not for the admin work. So I'm a big fan of automations, and I'm glad they exist in our lives. And thanks for mentioning the course. Yes, definitely. You talk a lot there about templates and workflows and everything else that you can have already that will help you plan things and help you understand what's going on in your company, not just from the creative point of view, but from operational point of view. So you're ready to scale. You can take on bigger projects, you can take on more clients, you can grow your agency without fear of burning out or missing important things. And I think that's probably the most important thing for any creative person when you get to the stage where you're ready to grow and scale. So how do you manage high workload and maintain high design quality at the same time? Where is this balance between perfection and the deadline? Perfection,
it should be the exception, not the rule. So as in thinking about perfection, like this has to be a certain, there's a role called a creative technologist, and they come up with there are a lot of prototypes and a lot of weird experimental type work, but they're such perfectionists that nothing ever ships, where they just keep ideating and into this infinity, as which is great, but they just need to rein it in. So I think that's one thing that gets challenging, is that as we care so much about the work and we want it to be super, super perfect, but have to balance the reality of the world and getting things out. So I would never recommend sending anything that's poor quality. but also to not be too married to the project or to the process, and be comfortable when it gets to a certain fidelity that it's like, okay, my baby's good to go. So because I think that can be kind of challenging sometimes, where it's like, oh, if I just had one more day, I could make this so much better. Yeah, I would say just to kind of decouple that in your mind from thinking about, yeah, just to maintain, not compromise quality by any means. And then I guess if I want to speak from a higher level, I would also say money is the answer. So hiring additional staff or additional support to be able to produce to a higher quality. So it's like, what are the levers that you can use? And if it's not time and you want higher quality, then you would need more budget to get that done. So either don't be married to perfection, or see if you can get more budget to make it perfect.
I love it. It's always about time, quality, and money, isn't it? You have to understand how to leverage all of those. What is the best way to visualize in real time the production status and timeline to your clients without giving them access to your project management tool?
With project management tools, so again, I can speak from the Asana way, is that I typically create an internal and an external project. So within the internal project, we can have things like internal reviews, feedback after crits, client insights and communications, things like any kind of private conversations that we would want to have with the agency. And then with the external project, that would be anything that we're comfortable with the client seeing. So and the timelines would be the same. So within Asana, there's a thing called multi-homing. So it's essentially the same task is within both projects. So you don't have to duplicate things. So that way you're not keeping up two separate timelines and making sure that they both match and are updated. You can have the same spectrum of information, but then have the internal project just have additional information that you would not share with the client. So that's been my approach, to really be able to keep them informed and not duplicating efforts by creating separate artifacts to send to them that are scrubbed or that are cleaned up, but just keeping the two projects in tandem.
Thank you, Ariel, for sharing all your wisdom. This is so, so great. I think we need, as creative people, more to think strategically, think operationally, to make sure that all these great ideas that we have actually see the world at the level that we like them to be. So thank you for sharing your advice.
Yeah, thanks everyone. This has been really fantastic. And, just taking a step back to put this together, because I'm like, no one has solved this, but I think these are some really easy things that folks can plug in. So even for me, I was able to take a step back and kind of assess what makes the most sense in doing this.